Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we are going to be looking at a book that's been making waves, The Avoidable War by Kevin Rudd.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure a lot of folks listening already know who Kevin Rudd is, right? Former Prime Minister of Australia.
Yeah, 2 times, actually.
Right, exactly. Two-time Prime Minister. But what's really fascinating about him is his deep expertise when it comes to China.
Oh, yeah. This is a guy who's not just a politician who's dabbling in foreign policy. This is someone who speaks fluent Mandarin. He wrote his thesis in college on human rights in China.
Exactly. I mean, this is someone who really gets it.
Yeah.
And so when he's talking about the U.S. and China and the potential for conflict, you got to listen up. It's not just some talking head. It's someone who's really spent his life trying to understand this relationship.
Yeah, and the book itself, The Avoidable War, I mean, the title alone is pretty striking.
Right.
Because it suggests that there is a path forward, that we don't have to stumble into some sort of catastrophic conflict. But it also lays out the very real risks and the challenges that we face.
Yeah, there's no sugarcoating here. He doesn't shy away from the difficult stuff, the historical baggage, the deep mistrust between these two superpowers, the potential for miscalculation, the things that could actually lead us down that path to war.
Right, and what I really appreciated about the book is that it's not just a doom and gloom scenario.
Yeah.
He doesn't just lay out the problems. He actually offers a framework for how to navigate this relationship, how to manage this competition in a way that avoids the worst-case scenario.
Absolutely, and that's what makes it so valuable, because it's not just about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about understanding both sides' perspectives, the Chinese perspective, the American perspective, and finding a way to bridge that gap, to find some common ground, to build some trust, even amidst this really intense competition.
Yeah, and the way he structures the book, I think, is really helpful, because he starts at the core with China's domestic politics, and then he kind of moves outward, exploring what he calls the 9 circles of Chinese foreign policy interests.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion, right? You got to start at the center to really understand what's driving China's actions on the world stage.
Exactly. So let's start there, at the core, with China's domestic politics. One of the things that Rudd really emphasizes is this deep-seated mistrust that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has towards the U.S.
Oh, yeah. He really digs into that. And he explains how this mistrust is rooted in history, right? You can't understand the current state of the relationship without going back and looking at the Opium Wars, the open door policy, the Cold War, all these events that have shaped China's view of the West, and particularly their view of the U.S.
Yeah, he talks about how China sees itself as having been humiliated by the West for centuries.
Yeah.
And they're determined to never let that happen again.
Right. And they see the U.S. as trying to contain them, to prevent them from achieving their rightful place as a global power.
And that fear is not entirely unfounded, is it? I mean, the U.S. has a long history of intervening in other countries' affairs, of trying to promote democracy and human rights, sometimes at the expense of stability or sovereignty.
Yeah, it's a complicated history, and one that's definitely shaped China's worldview. They see the U.S. as a threat to their system, to their values, to their very existence.
And that's why it's so important to understand their perspective. Even if we don't agree with it, we need to see the world through their eyes, to some extent, if we want to avoid conflict.
Absolutely. You can't just dismiss their concerns as irrational or propaganda. You have to try to understand where they're coming from and what's driving their actions.
And one of the things that Rudd does really well is he brings in his own personal experiences. Right? He's met with all these top Chinese leaders over the years. He's had these behind closed doors conversations. He's seen firsthand how they think, how they operate.
Yeah, he shares these amazing anecdotes about meeting with guys like Zhu Rongji, who was instrumental in Shanghai's economic transformation, and Jiang Zemin, who launched those patriotic education campaigns to instill a sense of national unity and warn against Western influence.
It's those little details, those glimpses behind the curtain that really bring the book to life and give you a sense of what it's like to be in the room with these guys, to understand how they view the world.
Absolutely. And it's not just about understanding the leaders, it's about understanding the system, the whole apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party, how it works, how decisions are made, how power is exercised.
Yeah, and how all of that shapes their interactions with the rest of the world.
Right, because ultimately, China's foreign policy is an extension of their domestic politics.
So we've talked about the historical baggage.
Yeah.
And the deep-seated mistrust that China has towards the U.S. But what about the specific anxieties that are driving their current policies? What are they most worried about right now?
Well, Rudd highlights a few key anxieties that are particularly relevant. One is this fear of what they call peaceful evolution.
Peaceful evolution?
Yeah, it's this idea that the U.S. is trying to undermine the CCP's rule by promoting Western values and supporting dissident groups.
So they see it as a kind of soft power subversion, an attempt to overthrow their system from within. Not through military force, but through ideas and culture.
Exactly. And they see evidence of this everywhere, right? In U.S. support for democracy activists in Hong Kong, in the spread of Western media and entertainment in China, in the activities of NGOs and human rights groups.
And to be fair, the U.S. does have a long history of promoting democracy and human rights around the world. So it's not entirely unreasonable for China to be suspicious of our intentions.
Right. I mean, we can't just pretend that our foreign policy has always been purely altruistic. There's definitely been an element of self-interest involved, and a belief that promoting democracy is in our national interest.
Yeah, and that can be a hard pill to swallow for a country like China that sees itself as being on the receiving end of that kind of intervention.
Absolutely. So this fear of peaceful evolution is a major driver of their domestic repression, their crackdown on dissent, their tight control over the internet and the media.
They see it as a matter of survival, right?
Yeah.
If they let Western ideas take root, they believe their system could collapse.
Yeah. Exactly. They're terrified of ending up like the Soviet Union.
So that's one big anxiety. What else are they worried about?
Another anxiety that Rudd highlights is the growing internal threat to the CCP's legitimacy, particularly the rise of alternative belief systems like Christianity.
Really, Christianity.
Yeah, it might seem strange to us, but the CCP sees religion as a potential challenge to their authority, a competing ideology that could erode their control over society.
It's interesting because on the surface, China has made these incredible economic strides, right? Millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, their economy is booming, they're a global powerhouse.
Yeah, but all that economic success hasn't necessarily translated into political legitimacy or social stability.
So they're still insecure about their hold on power. They're worried that people might start looking for something else, something more than just material prosperity.
Exactly, and that's where religion comes in. They see it as a potential threat to their monopoly on power.
And so they crack down on religious groups, they try to control the narrative, they promote atheism and materialism.
It's all about maintaining control and suppressing any potential challenges to their authority.
Okay, so we've got these two big anxieties, peaceful evolution and the rise of religion. What else is on their mind?
Well, another interesting point that Rudd makes is that despite all this anxiety and mistrust, the PLA, China's military, actually has a deep respect for U.S. military might.
Really? They respect our military?
Yeah, they've studied us. They've observed our actions in recent conflicts, and they're well aware of the technological gap that still exists between our two militaries.
So they're not delusional. They know they're not yet ready for a head-to-head confrontation with the U.S.
Right, and this is important to keep in mind, because it suggests that they're not necessarily eager for a fight. They understand the risks.
But does that mean they're less likely to initiate a conflict? I mean, does that give us some measure of reassurance?
Well, it's not that simple. Remember, China takes a very long-term view. They're patient, they're strategic, they're willing to bide their time to build up their strength before making any major moves.
So they're playing the long game.
Yeah.
They're not going to be rushed into anything. They're going to wait for the right moment.
Exactly. And that makes them a very formidable adversary.
It's a bit unsettling, isn't it? It suggests that this rivalry is only going to intensify as China continues to grow in power and confidence.
Absolutely. And that's why Rudd argues that we need to find a way to manage this competition, to prevent it from spiraling out of control. He believes that war is avoidable, but it's going to require a concerted effort on both sides.
Okay, so we've talked about China's anxieties and their respect for U.S. military might. But how do they actually assess power? What are their metrics? What are they looking at when they're comparing themselves to the U.S.?
Well, that's where the concept of comprehensive national power comes in. It's a very Chinese way of looking at power. It's not just about military might or economic size. It's a much broader assessment that takes into account a wide range of factors.
So it's like a holistic view of power.
Right, exactly. They're looking at political influence, cultural soft power,
Mhm.
technological innovation, social cohesion, even environmental sustainability.
So it's not just about guns and money. It's about the overall strength and resilience of a nation across multiple dimensions.
Right. And this helps explain why China is investing so heavily in areas like education, science, and technology, cultural diplomacy. They're trying to build their comprehensive national power across the board, not just in the military realm.
And it also explains why they're so focused on internal stability and social control. They see those as essential elements of national strength, just as important as military might or economic growth.
Exactly. They're trying to create a society that's harmonious, orderly, efficient, resilient.
So they can compete with the U.S. on all fronts.
Hmm.
not just militarily, but also economically, politically,
Yes.
culturally.
Exactly. They want to be a comprehensive superpower, a force to be reckoned with in every domain.
Okay, so we've explored China's domestic politics, their anxieties,
Wow.
their worldview, their concept of power. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the U.S. perspective. How does Washington view China? How has that perception evolved in recent years?
Well, Rudd argues that there's been a significant shift in the U.S. perspective, moving away from hopeful engagement to wary competition. For decades, there was this belief in Washington that as China got richer, they would become more democratic, more like us.
Right, the whole end of history idea,
Hmm.
that liberal democracy was the inevitable endpoint of human progress.
Exactly, and that economic engagement would lead to political liberalization. So the U.S. was very focused on integrating China into the global economy, bringing them into the WTO, encouraging trade and investment.
And for a while, it seemed like it was working, right? China was growing rapidly. They were opening up to the world. They were joining international institutions. They were playing by the rules, at least to some extent.
Yeah, but then things started to change. China didn't democratize the way many in Washington had hoped. They continued to crack down on dissent. They became more assertive in their foreign policy, and they started to challenge U.S. dominance in areas like trade and technology.
And that's when the disillusionment set in,
Hmm.
right? There was this growing sense that China had broken its promises and that they were taking advantage of U.S. goodwill to advance their own interests at our expense.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about economics, it was about values, too. The U.S. started to see China as a strategic competitor, a rival system,
Mm.
a threat to the liberal international order.
And this perception of China as a threat has really taken hold in Washington in recent years. It's now the dominant lens through which policymakers view the relationship.
Absolutely. And it's driving a shift in U.S. policy toward China, away from engagement and towards what they call strategic competition.
So the focus is now on containing China's influence, protecting American economic and security interests, strengthening alliances to counter China's growing power.
Exactly. It's a much tougher stance, a clear signal that the U.S. is no longer willing to give China a free pass.
And this shift is reflected not just in policy documents, but also in the rhetoric coming out of Washington, right? We're hearing a lot more talk about decoupling from China, reshoring manufacturing, building a coalition of democracies to confront the challenges posed by China.
Yeah, the honeymoon is definitely over.
Okay, so we've got this fundamental clash of perspectives, right? With China viewing the U.S. as a hostile force trying to contain their rise, and the U.S. viewing China as a strategic competitor that can't be trusted. It doesn't exactly bode well for the future, does it?
No, not really. And that's why Rudd's book is so timely and so important. He's trying to bridge this gap in understanding, to explain each side's perspective to the other, and to find a way forward that avoids a catastrophic conflict.
So how does he propose we do that? What's his solution to this seemingly intractable dilemma?
Well, he argues that the key is to understand the man at the helm of China's rise, Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping, the paramount leader.
Right. He devotes a significant portion of the book to analyzing Xi's background, his consolidation of power, and his central role in shaping China's current direction.
It's like he's trying to get inside Xi's head, right? To understand what makes him tick, what drives his ambitions, what his vision for China is.
Exactly. He goes beyond the typical portrayal of Xi as just another ruthless dictator. He explores his intellectual influences, his worldview, and his personal experiences to try to paint a more complete picture of the man.
So let's dive into that. What does Rudd tell us about Xi Jinping?
Well, he starts by looking at Xi's background, which is really crucial to understanding his worldview. He talks about Xi's childhood during the Cultural Revolution, a period of immense upheaval and violence in China. He was even sent to work in the countryside as a sent-down youth during that time, experiencing firsthand the hardships faced by ordinary Chinese people.
Wow, that must have had a profound impact on him, shaping his views on power hardship and the importance of social stability.
Absolutely. Rudd argues that these experiences instilled in Xi a deep sense of patriotism, a belief in the CCP's mission, and a determination to restore China to its former glory. He sees himself as a man of destiny tasked with leading China through a period of profound transformation and securing its rightful place as a global superpower.
And that ambition is reflected in his actions. Since coming to power in 2012, Xi has consolidated his control over the party, the military, and the state apparatus in a way that we haven't seen since Mao Zedong. He's purged his rivals, strengthened his grip on power, and established a personality cult that's unprecedented in recent Chinese history.
Yes, and he's overseen a dramatic shift in China's domestic and foreign policy. He's cracked down on dissent, tightened control over the internet and the media, and promoted a more assertive, even aggressive approach to international affairs. He's not afraid to flex China's muscles to challenge the U.S.-led order and to assert China's interests on the world stage.
So he's not just another technocrat, another faceless bureaucrat rising through the ranks of the CCP. He's a true believer, a visionary leader with a clear agenda and the determination to see it through.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand his vision, his goals, and his priorities, because they're going to shape China's trajectory for years to come, and they're going to have a profound impact on the U.S.-China relationship.
So how does Rudd break down Xi's vision? What are the key elements of his agenda?
Well, Rudd identifies what he calls Xi's 7 priorities, which provide a really useful framework for understanding China's actions on the world stage. These priorities cover a wide range of issues, from domestic politics to economic policy to foreign affairs.
Okay, let's take a closer look at these priorities. What's the first one?
The first priority is consolidating power. Xi sees this as essential to achieving his other goals. He needs to be in firm control of the levers of power to implement his vision for China's future.
And he's been incredibly effective at consolidating power. We've seen the anti-corruption campaigns, which have been used not just to root out corruption, but also to purge his rivals and instill fear in the ranks of the party.
And we've seen the increasing control over the military, with Xi appointing loyalists to key positions and asserting his authority as the commander-in-chief.
And let's not forget the propaganda machine, which has been working overtime to create a personality cult around Xi, portraying him as a wise and benevolent leader who has the best interests of the Chinese people at heart.
Right, he's sending a clear message. He's the boss, and no one dares to challenge his authority.
Okay, so that's consolidating power. What's the second priority?
The second priority is securing national unity. And as we discussed earlier, this is where the Taiwan issue takes center stage. For Xi, reuniting Taiwan with the mainland is a core objective, a matter of national pride and historical justice.
And he sees it as essential to achieving his broader goals of restoring China's greatness and securing his legacy.
Exactly. He's not just waiting for it to happen. He's taking concrete steps to increase pressure on Taiwan, conducting military exercises near the island, strengthening economic ties with Taiwan, and trying to isolate Taiwan diplomatically.
And he's making it clear that he's willing to use force if necessary to achieve reunification. He's even set a deadline of 2049, the centenary of the People's Republic, to achieve this goal.
Which creates a very real risk of conflict, especially if Taiwan resists China's advances or if the U.S. intervenes to defend Taiwan.
It's a potential powder keg,
Yes.
and one that we need to watch very carefully.
Okay, so the third priority is building economic resilience. This is where Xi's vision of common prosperity comes into play. He's trying to address some of the imbalances and inequalities that have arisen from China's rapid economic growth.
He's trying to create a more equitable society to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor and to ensure that the benefits of economic growth are more widely shared.
And this involves a shift in focus from purely economic growth to a more balanced approach that emphasizes social stability, environmental sustainability, and technological self-sufficiency. He wants to make China less reliant on foreign markets and technology, particularly in light of the trade war with the U.S. and the growing tensions over Taiwan and the South China Sea.
Right. It's about creating a more resilient economy, one that's less vulnerable to external shocks and pressures. And it's about ensuring that the CCP remains in control of the economy, even as it undergoes significant structural changes.
Exactly. He's not going to let the market run wild.
Yeah.
He wants to make sure that the party is in the driver's seat, steering the economy in a direction that serves the national interest.
Okay, let's move on to the fourth priority, achieving technological dominance. This is a key element of Xi's vision for China's future. He sees technological innovation as the key to economic growth, military power, and global influence.
And he's not shy about using the power of the state to achieve this goal. We've seen the Made in China 2025 initiative, which sets ambitious targets for China to become a global leader in key technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, and advanced manufacturing.
And we've seen massive investments in research and development, as well as efforts to acquire foreign technology through various means, including joint ventures, acquisitions, and let's be honest, espionage.
Right, and this is creating major tensions with the U.S., which sees China's technological ambitions as a direct threat to its own economic and national security interests.
Exactly. And it's contributing to the decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies as both sides try to limit their dependence on the other and protect their technological edge.
The fifth priority is modernizing the military. This is another key element of Xi's vision for China's rise as a global power. He sees a strong military as essential to defending China's interests, deterring its rivals, and projecting power abroad.
And he's been overseeing a massive transformation of the People's Liberation Army, shifting its focus from a primarily land-based force to a more modern, technologically advanced military capable of operating across multiple domains, including air, sea, space, and cyberspace.
And we've seen a significant increase in military spending, as well as the development of new weapon systems, including aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, hypersonic missiles, and advanced cyber capabilities.
And there's a renewed emphasis on joint operations and expeditionary warfare as China prepares to project power beyond its borders.
And this is causing major concern in the U.S. and among its allies in the region who see China's growing military might as a threat to regional stability and a challenge to the U.S.-led security architecture. It's contributing to an arms race in the Indo-Pacific as countries scramble to bolster their defenses in response to China's growing assertiveness.
Okay, so we've covered consolidating power, securing national unity, building economic resilience, achieving technological dominance, and modernizing the military. What are the last two priorities?
The sixth priority is managing China's neighboring states. This involves a complex mix of diplomacy, economic statecraft, and military power.
China's trying to cultivate friendly relations with its neighbors, using trade investment and infrastructure projects to create economic dependencies and reduce the influence of the U.S.
But they're not afraid to use coercion when necessary, as we've seen in their territorial disputes in the South China Sea.
Right, and they're playing a long game, exploiting divisions among their neighbors and using a combination of carrots and sticks to achieve their objectives.
And this is creating a very challenging environment for the U.S., which is struggling to maintain its influence in the region as China's power grows.
Okay, what about the final priority?
The seventh and final priority is securing China's maritime periphery. This involves asserting control over the waters surrounding China, including the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait.
It's a key element of China's broader strategy to break out of what it sees as a U.S.-led encirclement and establish itself as the dominant power in the region. And we've seen this strategy in action in recent years, with China building artificial islands in the South China Sea, deploying military assets, conducting provocative naval exercises, and increasingly challenging U.S. naval dominance in the region.
And this is creating a dangerous situation, as both sides are heavily armed and operating in close proximity. The risk of accidental escalation is very real. Rudd argues that the South China Sea is one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the U.S.-China relationship, one that has the potential to spark a wider conflict.
Okay, so we've covered Xi's 7 priorities, which give us a pretty comprehensive overview of his ambitions and his approach to leadership. Now, how does this all translate into action on the world stage? This is where Rudd introduces his concept of the 9 circles of Chinese foreign policy.
Exactly. The 9 circles represent different layers of China's engagement with the world, each building on the previous one. They offer a framework for understanding how China is projecting its power, expanding its influence, and pursuing its interests on a global scale.
So let's unpack these circles. What's the first one? Where does it all begin?
Well, the first circle is the core China's domestic politics. Everything else flows from this, so it's crucial to understand the foundations before moving outwards.
Right. We've already discussed the importance of China's domestic politics in shaping their worldview and their foreign policy. But how does this play out in their interactions with the rest of the world? How does the first circle influence the other 8?
Well, for starters, it determines the lens through which China views the world. Their deep-seated mistrust of the U.S., their anxieties about internal stability, and their emphasis on comprehensive national power all stem from their domestic political system and the CCP's grip on power.
So their domestic concerns and their foreign policy are inextricably linked. They can't be separated.
Exactly, and that's something that Western policymakers often fail to grasp. They tend to view China's actions in the world as purely strategic or geopolitical without fully appreciating the domestic political factors that are driving those actions.
So to understand China's behavior on the world stage, we need to understand what's happening inside China.
Precisely. And that's what the first circle is all about. It's the foundation upon which all of China's other foreign policy circles are built.
Okay, so let's move on to the second circle, securing national unity. This is where the Taiwan issue takes center stage.
Yes, and Rudd really drives home the point that Taiwan is not just some peripheral concern for China. It's absolutely central to their sense of national identity and historical legitimacy. Reunifying with Taiwan would be a crowning achievement for the CCP, a vindication of their historical narrative, and a demonstration of their power and legitimacy.
And as we discussed earlier, Xi Jinping has made it clear that he's willing to use force if necessary to achieve this goal. Rudd even speculates that Xi might be tempted to take military action to secure Taiwan.
Right. That would be a huge gamble, a highly risky move that could have catastrophic consequences. But it's a possibility that we can't ignore given Xi's ambitions and his determination to cement his legacy.
Okay, let's move on to the third circle, managing China's relationship with its 14 neighboring states. This is where we see the full range of China's diplomatic and economic tools at play, everything from the charm offensive of panda diplomacy to the hard-nosed tactics of economic coercion and even the occasional military saber-rattling.
Yes, and Rudd provides a fascinating analysis of China's approach to each of its neighbors, highlighting the historical baggage, the strategic considerations, and the economic interests that shape these relationships. He even draws a parallel to the U.S.'s Monroe Doctrine, suggesting that China might be seeking to establish its own sphere of influence in East Asia.
That's a provocative thought, and one that's bound to raise eyebrows in Washington.
Indeed. And it speaks to the broader shift in the balance of power that we're witnessing. China's no longer content to play a passive role in the region. They want to be the dominant force, and they're willing to use a variety of tools, both hard and soft, to achieve that goal.
Okay, let's talk about the fourth circle, securing China's maritime periphery. This is where the South China Sea dispute takes center stage.
Yes, and this is a particularly contentious issue with China claiming sovereignty over almost the entire South China Sea, much to the chagrin of its neighbors and the U.S. They've been building artificial islands, militarizing those islands, and conducting provocative naval exercises in the area, asserting their claims in a very aggressive manner.
And this has led to a lot of tension and mistrust, raising the risk of accidental clashes or even a deliberate confrontation. It's a real flashpoint, a potential trigger for a wider conflict.
Absolutely. And Rudd doesn't downplay the risks. He acknowledges that the South China Sea is a potential powder keg, a place where miscalculation or misperception could easily lead to an escalation of tensions.
So those are the first four circles of Chinese foreign policy, domestic politics: securing national unity, managing relations with neighboring states, and securing their maritime periphery. That covers a lot of ground.
Yes, it does. And we'll delve into the remaining five circles in the next part of our deep dive, exploring China's global ambitions, their approach to the developed world and the developing world, their military modernization, and their growing interest in the polar regions.
It's going to be a fascinating journey exploring the inner workings of China's foreign policy and the challenges it poses for the U.S. and the rest of the world. So stay tuned for part 2.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Kevin Rudd's The Avoidable War. Last time we were talking about the 9 circles of Chinese foreign policy and how they represent these layers of China's engagement with the world. We got through the first 4, remember? Those were focused on China's domestic politics and their regional interests, especially securing national unity, which of course means Taiwan, and managing those tricky relationships with their neighbors.
Yeah, and let's not forget about securing their maritime periphery. All that activity in the South China Sea.
Right, exactly. But now we're going to venture out a bit further. Look at how China is projecting its power and influence on a more global scale.
Okay, so where do we go next? Which circle are we tackling now?
Well, the 5th circle takes us westward, along those ancient Silk Road routes, and right into the heart of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Oh yeah, the BRI. This massive global infrastructure project has been making headlines for years now, trillions of dollars in investment spanning multiple continents. It's mind-boggling, really, when you think about the scale of it.
It is. It's arguably one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in human history. I mean, we're talking roads, railways, ports, pipelines, energy projects, all sorts of stuff, connecting China to Europe, Africa, the Middle East. It's a huge undertaking.
And China's been pushing it really hard, right?
Mhm.
They see it as a key part of their global strategy.
Absolutely. Rudd argues that the BRI is much more than just an economic development project. It's a way for China to expand its influence, secure access to vital resources, and reshape the global order in a way that's more favorable to their interests.
So it's about power projection, as much as it is about economic development.
Exactly. And they're doing it very strategically, targeting countries in the developing world that are often overlooked or underserved by Western powers, offering loans, investments, expertise, often with fewer strings attached than Western aid programs.
It sounds like a pretty good deal for those countries, right? They get much-needed infrastructure and investment, and China gets access to new markets and resources.
Yeah, on the surface, it can seem like a win-win situation, but there are definitely some downsides, some potential risks that we need to be aware of.
Like what? What are some of the concerns?
Well, there are concerns about debt traps, where developing countries become saddled with unsustainable levels of debt to China, and then they become dependent on China to bail them out, which gives China a lot of leverage.
Ah, so it's not always altruistic.
Right. There are also worries about environmental damage, corruption, and lack of transparency in some BRI projects. Some critics argue that China is using the BRI to exploit developing countries and to advance their own interests at the expense of others.
So it's a mixed bag. It's not all good. It's not all bad. It's complicated.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have a nuanced understanding of the BRI. It's neither a purely benevolent development project nor a purely sinister geopolitical scheme. It's somewhere in between, a complex and multifaceted initiative with both potential benefits and potential risks.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the sixth circle, which focuses on modernizing China's military. This is a topic that always seems to generate a lot of anxiety, especially in the U.S.
Yeah, and for good reason. China's military modernization has been incredibly impressive. They've poured enormous resources into developing advanced weapon systems, improving their training and logistics, and expanding their ability to project power far beyond their borders.
It's like they're going through a checklist of all the things a superpower needs,
Right.
right? Aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, hypersonic missiles, advanced cyber capabilities. You name it, they're working on it.
Exactly. And it's not just about the hardware. They're also developing new doctrines and strategies, adapting to the changing nature of warfare and preparing to operate in new domains like space and cyberspace.
So it's a comprehensive modernization effort, one that's transforming the PLA into a truly formidable force.
Yeah.
And it's happening against the backdrop of Xi Jinping's increasingly assertive foreign policy.
Right, which emphasizes China's willingness to use force to defend its interests. And that makes the whole thing even more concerning for the U.S. and its allies.
Because it suggests that China's not just trying to catch up to the U.S., they're trying to surpass us to become the dominant military power in the world.
That's certainly how a lot of people in Washington see it, and it's driving a lot of the anxiety and the calls for increased military spending.
Okay, so we've got the BRI, we've got the military modernization. What about China's relationship with the rest of the developed world? Where do countries like the U.S., Europe, Japan, and other Western allies fit into all of this? That's the seventh circle, right?
Yes, that's right. The seventh circle focuses on managing China's relationship with the advanced industrial democracies. And this is where things get really tricky because you've got this clash of values, this fundamental tension between China's authoritarian system and the democratic values of the West.
Right, it's not just a geopolitical rivalry, it's an ideological one as well.
Exactly. And that makes it much harder to find common ground, to build trust, and to manage the competition in a way that's stable and predictable.
So how does China approach this relationship? What's their strategy?
Well, it's a balancing act, a delicate dance between cooperation and competition. On the one hand, China recognizes that they need the West, they need trade and investment, and they need to collaborate on issues like climate change and pandemics.
So they can't afford to completely alienate the West.
Right. But on the other hand, they're also determined to challenge Western dominance, to reshape the global order, and to promote their own authoritarian model as a viable alternative to liberal democracy.
It sounds like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too.
In a way, they are. They're trying to compartmentalize the relationship, to separate the economic from the political, to engage with the West on issues where their interests align, while simultaneously pushing back against Western influence in areas where they see it as a threat.
So it's a very pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
Kind of realpolitik, where they're willing to be friends when it's beneficial, but also willing to be rivals or even enemies when they see it as necessary.
Exactly. And this makes it very difficult for Western policymakers to develop a coherent strategy for dealing with China, because they're constantly trying to figure out whether China is a partner, a competitor, or an adversary. And the answer, of course, is all of the above, depending on the issue and the context.
It's a confusing and frustrating situation to be in for sure.
It is, and it's one of the biggest challenges facing the U.S. and its allies in the 21st century. Okay, let's move on to the eighth circle, which takes us to the developing world. This is where China has been making a lot of headway in recent years.
Yeah, they've become a major player in Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Asia, offering loans, investments, and expertise to countries that are eager for development and maybe not so concerned about China's human rights record.
Exactly. It's a very different approach than the West's traditional development model, which often comes with conditions attached, like demands for political reforms or human rights improvements.
Right, China's approach is much more hands-off,
Yeah,
much less judgmental.
exactly. They're offering a no-strings-attached approach to development, which is very appealing to many countries that are tired of being lectured by the West.
Hmm.
And they're backing it up with real money, with massive investments in infrastructure, energy, and other sectors.
And they're also leveraging their own experience as a developing country, right?
Right.
They can say, look, we've been there, we've done that, we know what it takes to develop your economy and improve the lives of your people.
Exactly, and that resonates with a lot of developing countries that see the West as hypocritical, lecturing them about democracy and human rights while simultaneously exploiting their resources and propping up corrupt regimes.
So China is presenting itself as an alternative to the West,
Yeah.
a different model of development, a new path to prosperity that doesn't require embracing Western values or political systems.
Exactly, and that's a very powerful message, one that's winning them a lot of friends and influence in the developing world.
Okay, finally, we come to the ninth and final circle, which takes us to a very different part of the world, the polar regions.
Yes, this might seem like an unusual addition to China's foreign policy agenda, but it's actually quite strategic. China sees the Arctic in particular as a region of growing importance, both economically and strategically.
I can see why. As the ice melts due to climate change, the Arctic is becoming increasingly accessible, opening up new shipping routes, new opportunities for resource extraction, and new strategic possibilities.
Exactly, and China is not going to be left out of this new frontier. They're investing heavily in Arctic research infrastructure and diplomacy, trying to secure a foothold in this rapidly changing region.
But that's raising concerns among the Arctic nations like Canada, Russia, and the U.S., who are wary of China's intentions and their potential to disrupt the delicate balance of power in the region.
Absolutely. The Arctic is becoming another arena for great power competition, and China's entry into this game is adding another layer of complexity and uncertainty to the geopolitical landscape.
So we've come full circle, from China's domestic politics to their global ambitions in the polar regions. The nine circles really do paint a comprehensive picture of China's foreign policy agenda, their strategic goals, and the tools they're using to achieve them.
Yes, they do, and they highlight the enormity of the challenge facing the U.S. and other Western powers. China is not just a regional power anymore, they're a global player with ambitions that extend to every corner of the planet, and they're not going to be easily contained or deterred.
So where does that leave us? What's the next step? How do we manage this complex and increasingly fraught relationship with a rising China?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. We'll delve into Rudd's proposed framework for managed strategic competition and examine whether it's possible to find a path forward that avoids a catastrophic clash between these two superpowers.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Welcome back to the show. You know, we've spent the last two parts of this deep dive really digging into Kevin Rudd's The Avoidable War. We've explored China's perspective, their anxieties, their ambitions, their strategy for dealing with the U.S. and the rest of the world.
Yeah, we talked about those nine circles of Chinese foreign policy and Xi Jinping's 7 priorities. It's been a pretty intense journey, a lot to unpack, but now we're at the part where we have to ask the big question.
The million-dollar question.
Right.
What's the path forward? Can we avoid a war between the U.S. and China?
Exactly. Can we find a way to coexist peacefully, even as these two superpowers are vying for dominance on the world stage?
Well, that's what Rudd tries to answer in the final part of his book. And he's cautiously optimistic. He argues that war is not inevitable.
Okay, so he doesn't think we're doomed to some sort of inevitable clash of civilizations.
No, he doesn't. He believes that there's still time to change course, to find a way to manage this rivalry without resorting to war. But it's going to require a new approach, a shift in thinking on both sides.
Okay, so what does he propose? What's his solution to this problem?
Well, he calls for what he terms managed strategic competition.
Manage strategic competition. That's a mouthful.
It is, but it basically means finding a way to compete with China without letting that competition spiral out of control.
So how do you do that? How do you manage competition between two superpowers that are fundamentally at odds with each other?
Well, it's not about eliminating competition. That's not realistic. The U.S. and China are going to compete. It's inevitable, given their different interests and values. But it's about channeling that competition into more constructive avenues, establishing clear rules of the road, and finding ways to cooperate on issues of shared interest.
Okay, so it's a balancing act. Competing where necessary, cooperating where possible, and always trying to prevent things from escalating into conflict.
Exactly. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to require a lot of hard work, a lot of diplomacy, and a lot of political will on both sides. But Rudd believes it's the only way to avoid a war that would be devastating, not just for the U.S. and China, but for the entire world.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit.
Yeah.
What are the key elements of managed strategic competition? What would it actually look like in practice?
Well, first and foremost, it would require clear and consistent communication between the two sides. They need to establish mechanisms for regular dialogue at all levels, from the leadership level down to the working level, to discuss their interests, their concerns, and their intentions.
So talking more, listening more, trying to understand each other's perspectives. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do you go beyond just talking? How do you create a framework that actually constrains behavior and reduces the risk of conflict?
That's where the rules of the road come in. Rudd argues that the U.S. and China need to establish a set of clear and mutually agreed upon rules and norms that govern their behavior in various areas, including trade, investment, technology, cybersecurity, and military activities.
So like a code of conduct, a set of guidelines that both sides agree to abide by.
Exactly. And these rules would need to be very specific, very detailed, covering a wide range of issues.
So for example, in the realm of trade, they might agree to abide by WTO rules, refrain from currency manipulation, and protect intellectual property rights. In the realm of cybersecurity, they might agree to limits on certain types of cyber attacks, such as those targeting critical infrastructure or stealing intellectual property.
Exactly. And in the realm of military activities, they might agree to confidence-building measures to reduce the risk of miscalculations, such as sharing information about military exercises or establishing hotlines for communication during a crisis.
That's a pretty ambitious agenda. What's to stop either side from cheating or breaking the rules when it suits them?
That's where verification mechanisms come in. Rudd argues that any framework for managed strategic competition needs to include robust verification mechanisms to ensure that both sides are complying with the agreed-upon rules.
So we're talking about things like independent monitoring, data sharing, and possibly even on-site inspections.
Yes, exactly. It's going to require a level of transparency and trust that doesn't currently exist between the two countries. But Rudd believes it's essential if we want to create a stable and predictable relationship.
Okay, so that's managed strategic competition. It's a challenging framework for sure,
Yeah.
but it's also a hopeful one. It suggests that we can avoid war with China. But what about the U.S.'s role in all of this? What does Rudd say about what we need to do here at home?
Well, he's pretty blunt about it. He says that the U.S. needs to get its own house in order. He argues that we've been distracted by internal divisions, political polarization, and economic challenges, and that this has weakened our ability to compete effectively with China.
He's not pulling any punches. He's
Yeah.
basically saying that we need to step up our game.
Exactly. He's saying that we need to get serious about addressing our internal problems and to develop a more coherent and strategic approach to dealing with China. We can't just react to their moves. We need to be proactive. We need to have a plan.
So what does that look like in practice? What specific steps does he recommend?
Well, he talks about the need for a national renewal agenda in the U.S., one that focuses on rebuilding our infrastructure, investing in education and innovation, addressing income inequality, and restoring a sense of unity and purpose. He argues that we need to be strong and cohesive at home if we want to be effective abroad.
That makes sense. You can't project strength and leadership on the world stage if you're struggling with internal weaknesses and divisions.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the need for a more strategic and coherent approach to foreign policy, one that focuses on building alliances, strengthening international institutions, and promoting democratic values. He argues that we need to work with our allies to present a united front to China and to push back against their attempts to undermine the existing order.
So it's not just about competing with China. It's about building a coalition of like-minded countries that share our values and our commitment to a rules-based international order.
Right. And it's about being clear-eyed about the challenges posed by China, avoiding both naive engagement and reckless confrontation. It's about finding the right balance between competition and cooperation, between pushing back against their aggressive behavior and working with them on issues of shared interest.
It's a delicate balancing act, but it's essential if we want to avoid a catastrophic conflict.
Absolutely. And that's why Rudd's book is so important. It's a wake-up call, a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent or take this relationship for granted. It's a call to action, a plea for reason and restraint, and a reminder that the choices we make today will have profound consequences for generations to come.
This deep dive into the U.S.-China relationship has definitely given us a lot to think about. And if you want to go deeper, I definitely recommend checking out Kevin Rudd's The Avoidable War. It's a challenging read, but it's essential if you want to understand the forces at play in our world and how we can prevent a truly devastating conflict.
And on that note, it's time for us to surface from this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.